Hello, and welcome to our last installment of our Conversations on Substance Use During COVID-19 webinar series through Foundry Virtual. Today, we're going to be talking about pathways to harm reduction and recovery with two guest speakers from the Foundry team. Our first guest speaker is Elise Durante, who is the Manager of Service Innovation and Integration at Foundry Central, as well as Raymond Jordan Johnson Brown, who is a Youth Engagement Coordinator through Foundry Central. I would like to also acknowledge that today this presentation is taking place on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the traditional of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And with that, I would like to pass it off to RJ.
Yay, well, thank you so much for that warm and wonderful introduction. Paige and I actually worked together on the virtual team, so I know Paige very well, and I have a deep care for them. And yeah, I just respect you so much. So thank you for bringing this conversation, this very important conversation to light with myself and Elise. And I know we are excited to have an informal dialogue and conversation about some of our both personal reflections on this work as well as our professional reflections. And I guess we will start by saying that some of this dialogue isn't necessarily the opinion of Foundry, as much as it is just the opinion of two human beings on this journey and learning and growing collaboratively together with each and every one that we get to work with and engage with. So, yes, my name is Raymond Jordan Johnson Brown, or you can call me RJ. I use his pronouns, and yeah, I'm a youth engagement coordinator at Foundry Central Office. And then Elise, I will let you introduce.
Thank you, RJ. Thanks for such a wonderful way to start off. My name is Elise Durante. I live here on the unceded territories of the Coast Salish people, the Hul'qumi'num speaking people here in the Cowichan Valley of the Penelakut and Staminas First Nations. So I'd like to offer an acknowledgement of that. And in Hul'qumi'num, you say good day, Haisquela. So Haisquela. My role here is as a manager of service implementation and integration, and really what that means is helping support communities bring a Foundry Center into their community in a way that really makes sense for the local needs and the assets and the strengths of that community, and also perhaps what the gaps are, and kind of bringing it all together in a very specific way for each community. So I'm grateful to be here. And my pronouns that I use are she, her. And I'm nervous because it's being recorded, and that's like not a thing I'm used to. And was I supposed to say anything else, RJ? Were we supposed to start off with talking about like why we're here, or like some of our?
Yeah, we left it so open-ended, and I appreciate your being honest with the experience of being recorded and being in this environment. I think sometimes we have these pressures when we do webinars or sharing that we have to be somewhere and we must be this leader and we can't feel feelings. So I just appreciate the humanity that is you and sharing your experience right off the top. So we are, I was gonna say, to transition and segue us in, I think for me, substance use journeys and recovery pathways, I've always been curious to know the why. And so, Elise, maybe we'll start with you and saying, from a personal standpoint, taking off the professional hat. From a personal standpoint, what is your connection to this work? In a bit of.
Yeah, thanks. I might do both, if that's okay, the personal and the professional, because I think the personal brought me into the professional in that way. That I grew up in Southern California during Nancy Reagan's Just Say No days, and those early days of seeing drugs and seeing people who use drugs as bad, and being taught that it was criminal, it was a bad thing, and knowing pretty early on in my life that wasn't true, because I had family members that were using different substances, some in more problematic ways than others, and the minute as a young person I started to experiment with drugs and use drugs, I realized any adult or any person in authority who said drugs are bad are really missing the nuance of it, and missing the pieces around like the context of why people use drugs, the reasons why they do, the reasons why some folks fall into addictions while others don't, why some people are criminalized or taken into custody because they're drug users. There's just like so many layers of complexity to it that I experienced somewhat firsthand, and then seeing my friends and family members go through different journeys than my own, I realized it was really unique. And also there was this idea of what's illegal and what's immoral. It just gets in the way of so much connection and so much access to care. And I think I started off as a social, I was trained to be a social worker. And I think that was one of the things that really brought me to the work, was knowing there's all these different systems and layers, and social work, even as a profession, has interfered and taken away people's rights and really it's as part of it. Like, it's like we're all in it in this way. And so I really wanted to kind of bring some of that, the complexity of the experiences I'd had, just to walk alongside people and help them find what was going to work for them and their journey, and just that open mind and curiosity. And yeah, I think that hopefully that's what's brought me to the work. And just on a professional level, before I worked for Foundry Central, I was a clinical coordinator at Foundry Vancouver Granville, and before that I worked at it really started my work in working in HIV and primary care as an addictions counselor, and then worked at a heroin assistant treatment crosstown before that, after that. So I kind of worked in harm reduction in lots of ways, and really felt like those are my people in terms of, like, from a professional perspective, and as, you know, clients, just being able to talk to people about their drug use, but also talk about all these other things and all the, like, art, and talk about access to food and what, like, just looking at people in so much more of a full way. And I think, yeah, that's one of the reasons I'm happy to talk about harm reduction a bit. So yeah. So thanks for asking me, but I want to also hear, like, yeah, from your experience. I know you bring your own, like, passion to everything. And so what brings you to this journey?
Of course, when I just wanted to highlight what you said around, like, recognizing the wholeness of a human being is so critical. Living in the downtown east side, I'll regularly connect with peers who will make commentaries and assumptions on the people that walk the streets. And I always challenge them, and I say, you don't know what story got them to where they are, and you don't know that where they are isn't that where they don't want to be. And so, yeah, it's a really interesting thing, and I think it's really important that you brought that up. Here, for myself, I was raised by a single alcoholic mother, and so, as well as my grandparents were both alcoholics, and we, as a result of a wealth of pieces to the story, have been a family riddled with addiction, and generationally that has continued. And so that led me to, as a queer male coming into 20, you know, if we went to the club, you know, whatever anybody had, you were taking. And at what started off as a curiosity and a healthy thing started to shift into job losses, not coming into work, not paying bills, and, you know, coming into just a dark place mentally, to the point where, you know, I lacked motivation to continue. I was really just not the person who I saw myself being. And so in the initial phases, I took a harm reduction lens to my drug use and my alcoholism, and I said, you know, I'm going to reduce the usage. And as I grew in that, I recognized that reducing it almost became like a binger. It turned into that. So creating kind of safety and around usage was the suggested method. I tried it, didn't succeed. And so I ultimately had to make my own decision that abstinence was the route. And I firmly believe, you know, as an Indigenous person, that, you know, this is a poison. This is not meant for my system. And the negative consequences that came anytime I indulged in these substances showed me that this is not the route for me. And that's what it was for me. And so how that translated into my professional work is, I've just growing up with my single alcoholic mother and then transitioning into foster care. For me, I really wanted to be able to, fortunately, I had a positive experience in that regard in the care system. And I wanted to be able to create that positivity in a system where you feel so out of control as a young person. And so professionally, as I came to this work, it's been a lot of child welfare and working in group homes and just building plans to help support youth supporting themselves and having that right to self-determination in their own lives, recognizing that there are so many layers of legislative practices that go on and continue to this day. So it is quite complex. It is not easy work. It is emotional labor, but it is important work. And I am honored to be here and have that conversation with you. So that's me.
I love how, I mean, you talk about sort of that, I think we both share that ability, like thinking about the birth of the whole person, but also just really focusing on what someone's choices are and what they're wanting, what their goals are individually, and like seeing the different parts of their life and what they're looking for in those ways. And I think that's a really important part of this conversation around from harm reduction to recovery is really looking at all those different, I think of facets, and I don't really know what that word means, but just different like angles of a picture of a situation to kind of really build out what's going to work for somebody. So, you know, like, and even like when you talk about like your experience and like wanting to, you had some positive experiences and wanting to sort of help other people find positivity in their lives and on their journeys. Yeah, that's just, beautiful. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, thank you. And so now I feel like we have many conversations at Foundry Show between us and others about this work. And so, and you always, I love the idea of this continuum of substance use. So I'm wondering if for everyone watching and listening, if you could dive into that.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So I think this was kind of one of those aha moments for me, and where I also saw both my experience and the experience of loved ones kind of reflected in a way that I'm like, oh, actually this model sort of fits. It's not just about the type of substance and whether that substance is bad or good, or whether they're using it in a bad or good way. It just talks about kind of the continuum, the spectrum of substance use. So on one side, and this is actually from work we used to do in core addictions practice training. So this is not my own work. But on the one end of it, you have actually like beneficial use. So the fact that people use caffeine in beneficial ways. People use red wine in beneficial ways, and then maybe part of a spiritual practice as well. Like the beneficial use is actually being acknowledged. And abstinence is also for some people that's there's that's a benefit. And so along the continuum, and for different kind of the substance use increases, but also maybe the consequences or the potential consequences increase. So and then it goes into experimental use. So that's, in that limited, maybe more on weekends or every now and then. And really the things that often drive that are things, like curiosity, and then just, really humans' experience of wanting to alter their consciousness. Like this is a very human experience, whether it's by driving really fast or on a car, running. I know people who go for these long runs that I'm like not athletic at all, so I can't imagine, but they like experience it as like a mind altering experience, right? Or long mindfulness or meditation retreats. So yeah, humans' experiences of wanting to alter their consciousness is kind of always fit with it. So people find different ways to do that. So then it goes from experimental use to kind of occasional or social use, and then into more regular use. So that's when you start to see things that may interfere with other functions, or might not, but that's just when maybe that would start to happen as well. And then at the kind of further end of the spectrum, there's this addiction, dependency, problematic use, and these things that often we look at often is what we talk about when we talk about substance use, and it sometimes gets in the way of us just talking about the range of substance use. I think sometimes when we just talk about addictions and dependency, and I think quite tragically, and sometimes this is one of the things that's been confused with the horrible drug poisoning and overdose crisis that we're experiencing around the world, and particularly in BC, is that sometimes people just cast substance use and drug use as always addiction or always dependency, and it misses that, again, there's many people who have passed away in this crisis, and many lives lost, and too many lives lost. And it is, again, you see that range of some people who just may use every now and then, some people who are really dependent in a physical, dependency way, and so there's again that range that I always want to kind of bring to as to how somebody might be using substances and where they're falling in that spectrum.
Definitely. I remember I shared a quote on my Instagram once, and I said, remember when you see someone struggling with addiction, you aren't any better because your addiction is socially acceptable. And I think looking at this from this continuum lens really helps to inform and understand that idea. I often bring up the story of my mom, who she's a AA, go to the 12-step meetings, and now she's moved into a recovery 2.0 model of holistic yoga infused. And she'll always say, you know, RJ, you didn't do AA, you didn't go to a treatment center, so, you know, that's a problem. And I always challenge her and I say, but my pathway is different to recovery than yours, because the reasons why I used were different than yours. And we always get in this fun back and forth. And that's why I think, especially as service providers, human beings, just general participants in this wild world that we're in, we have to be aware of the continuum and the opportunity to experience, like you said. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
And so we go from this continuum, and I want to hopefully capture some of this idea and some of the history around harm reduction. We hear harm reduction a lot, and I know you're a historian of harm reduction. So I'm wondering if you could enlighten us and just have a little bit of dialogue around, you know, the history of harm reduction and how that's evolved, particularly in BC. I think it's a fair statement to say it's been one of the most progressive provinces in this work. And yeah,
thanks. And I am far from a historian. I'm an enthusiast. And really, I think, again, it's, and again, so I'm not an expert in harm reduction's kind of origins in that way, but I do know, you know, it came out of social justice. It came out activism, and it came out of people who use drugs organizing themselves, and just telling politicians, telling healthcare workers what they needed, and community coming together. So, you know, in San Francisco, you know, there's syringe programs, there's needle exchange, and people have been organizing to take care of each other in the drug using community in many communities for, you know, generations and for years. And I think harm reduction sort of helped to recognize that and put it in a way that other folks could see. And my experience with harm reduction was really working in HIV and seeing, you know, that piece around, you know, the pragmatic approach that sometimes people are going to continue. People use drugs for a variety of reasons, and what can we do to reduce the risks associated with that substance use? And sometimes when people talk, and so now it's like a public health perspective, and so people will talk about other things that we do in harm reduction to reduce the risk of other risky behaviors. So, you know, people often will use the example of seatbelts, because cars themselves are incredibly risky. They're incredibly dangerous, incredibly powerful. And I think of substances in the same way. You know, some people see the substances as medicine, and some of them are used as medicine, and they also have this other side that's, you know, incredibly powerful and carries with it a significant risk. So what can we do to reduce the risk? Well, in a car that can go really, really fast, they can make it so it can't go to a certain point. And they can also put seatbelts in so that people do choose to drive fast for whatever reason, that if they get in an accident, there's some significant safety put in place for them. And also, like, all those kinds of things. So I think of harm reductions as kind of many of those layers. I mean, and, you know, I think one of the things I appreciate about harm reduction was, you know, again, that, you know, harm reduction is about love. It's about community. It's about connection. It's about, like, you know, I think people have likened, you know, the Black Panther movement, and how, you know, in Oakland, like, you know, people were feeding each other and feeding their community, and that was harm reduction. So food is part of harm reduction. Housing is harm reduction. Like, you know, those basic human rights for everybody is, you know, I think a critical part of my understanding of kind of what harm reduction is and how it shows up in practice. And one last thing, and I'll stop talking.
No. Yeah. Oh, I love it.
This part that I think somehow we've fallen into, I think we're getting better, but in BC we're getting better, but I don't necessarily see it elsewhere, is that, like, it's like this either or, like, harm reduction is seen on one side, and then, like, substance use recovery or addictions recovery is seen as like two different opposing poles. And I've never experienced them as that, because for some people, harm reduction is their, like you described, like, it's their way into care. It's their way into talking to somebody, not care like, you know, a formal system, but in terms of a caring relationship. It's like being accepted for whatever, and then, like, establishing a relationship and establishing trust and establishing some safety, so that if for some reason they want to reduce or change their substance use, there's an established relationship or established connection that we could kind of, you know, work from.
Totally. No, I absolutely love that. And so I also think it's an important reflection as a service provider, and in a wealth of arenas that viewers and people watching this might get to be in, is that the harm reduction model is also applicable to other areas. it's often associated, and I think its origins are in substance use, but it's so much more than that. And again, it's about creating that safety, helping to empower those that are on their substance use journeys or on their journeys in this life, and breaking down that stigma. So I'm hoping we can share, and these principles of harm reduction, I think, are very transferable. These are accessible and available for each and every person on the harm reduction website, who does a lot of great work to organize some of these thoughts and ideas. So this first one being, number one, accepts for better or for worse that illicit and drug and wow, I can't even speak. That illicit and illicit drug use is part of our world, and it chooses to work to minimize its harmful effects rather than simply ignore or condemn them. And so I think, I've seen a lot of people, in this world who have choose to, apologies, I have a puppy. That's the world. We've seen a lot of people who choose to participate in substances show. Wow, I lost my complete train of thought, Elise.
That's okay. I'm sure it was gonna go somewhere brilliant. It still might.
In lieu of the weather, it's just such a fun world we live in these days, working and doing everything from home while your dog eats everything in the background. So I'm gonna go. So I'm gonna share from my own life with this one about the acceptance that it is a reality and a very real a part of our life. And this is actually a story of my foster parents. And so we had an aunt who had identified a problem in herself, that she had issues with alcoholism. And what my family did, because my foster parents are Jamaican, there was always this perception that we had to present externally well to everyone. I think it's common in many cultures and human beings that we want to present well. And so I remember going to my foster mom and I said, hey, I think we should maybe help her. Maybe get her some therapy. And I remember my foster mom said to me, she's like, no. We don't talk about it. It's not there. And that was only 12, 13 years ago. And I'm sure that still, is relevant and it exists today. So I think just starting with the reality and the acceptance is so critical. 100%.
And I think, it's also, if we talk about that in terms of what different substances there are, like we've accepted that certain substances are part of our world more than for some reason they feel challenged to accept other substances as part of our kind of most people's lives. And you think of alcohol being accepted as part of many people's experiences, and so do things to minimize its harmful effects. Rather, so there's packaging. So I remember when the Bacardi, or there was another distiller that they had for some reason issued a bunch of hard alcohol that was like double the proof that it was supposed to be. Wow. And so before people could get out there and buy as much as they wanted, because they were looking for that quick fix, and the liquor stores pulled it off the shelves, right? But because it's labeled and because there's quality control, it's like we've accepted alcohol, and so we've done things to minimize the harmful effects that could be associated with, like, for example, consuming a whole bunch of high percentage alcohol unintentionally. Sorry, I didn't mean to jump in there. I just
No, I love it. Thank you. And going.
No, you go ahead.
Okay. Going into our next principle, and this brings up what you said, Elise, about multifaceted, recognizing that this drug use is a complex, multifaceted phenomenon that operates on that continuum of behaviors from severe use to my own choices around total abstinence, and some are safer than others, and it's important that we have that understanding from the get-go of having these conversations with folks that we work with. And then we go on to number 3. Elise, I don't know if can you see the same screen that I'm seeing?
Yeah, I can totally see it. It's, I think this one, it's about, the quality of individual life isn't about and I think so many of our programs, unfortunately, are I think we're moving away from it, but they're looking at how successful an intervention is based on whether it's affected someone's substance use. Like, okay, this, let's say this group this therapy group was helpful because people stopped drinking as much or stopped smoking, as opposed to what other parts of their life have benefited, what else is going on, how is their general well-being, and how that's affected by engagement in this program or not. So looking at quality of life is really the indicators of what's going to be, whether it's effective or not as an intervention and policy.
I love it.
And so this is really around the number 4 is around, just again, not having, calling for non-judgmental, non-coercive provision of services. So really this is about, human rights and making sure people have access to healthcare, housing, nutrition, and it's not dependent on whether or not they're using substances or not. Like they're just, can access nutrition and housing and libraries and everything else.
I saw one thing too, I think with when it rains down in some of the shelters, that some shelters are pet friendly and some aren't. That's an important consideration in some of this work. And then number 5, so we're showing that people who use drugs and those with history of drug use routinely have a real voice in the creation of programs and policies designed to serve them. And I think this actually speaks to a lot of the work, particularly in BC and work of CMHA and Foundry around peer support, as both a profession as well as hearing voices at a diverse offering of tables throughout organizations, and honoring lived experience in a field where lived experience was almost shamed. You didn't want to mention. If you mentioned that maybe you were an alcoholic, that might hinder your ability to be hired. Whereas now we're in a lot of hiring practices at a lot of organizations to honor lived experience the same way we do educational experience.
And I think this one is, I often think of the motto, nothing about us without us. And that's, again, from, activist groups, and it really, and it just that has informed everything, all these other kind of policies and kind of where we're at now. And that was really people joining together and sharing their experiences and bringing change, from where they're coming from. So, and that's one of the most important foundations, I believe, of harm reduction, is that nothing about us without us.
I love that. And moving into number 6, we're talking about affirming people who use drugs themselves as the primary agents of reducing the harms of their drug use, and seeks to empower. And this word empower is so important to me, and it's this idea, I heard it framed where it's moving from a sense of powerlessness to a sense of self-power. I really loved how that was framed, and I think it's so critical. It's a core principle to all of the different services and work that we do. And our next 2, Elise, if you want to take it away.
Sure. I think this is really about how harm reduction and the services we want to be seeing out there need to be trauma informed. They need to be looking at how racism, poverty, class, those pieces, how that discrimination has affected where someone's at, and also how it can increase someone's vulnerability and the challenges with engaging in care with lots of legitimate reasons. And I think, it's always taking that lens into, like, for example, the example I often, use around how race, and I'm not the only one who uses it, but it's around how sentencing for possession of cocaine is different in the States. And this changed a bit, but for a long, long time, it was the same, whether it's a quantity of rock cocaine, so which is smoked, or powder cocaine, and those have class-based differences in the prevalence of use between them. They were criminalized differently, and the prison sentence was much heavier for rock, which is smoked, and just all these kinds of things. There's all these different layers of things that we really have to always look at policy and look at how the laws are affecting people in these ways that are just continuing on with racism and classism in different ways. And then, you know, the 8 is we're not going to minimize or ignore the real and tragic harm and danger that's associated with illicit drug use. And it's important that we use illicit drug use because it's an unregulated drug use. And that we're not, it's always important just to kind of keep those, like, we need to look at how we're going to reduce harms and what we can do to support that. And in BC, again, the expansion of safer or pandemic prescribing or safer supply prescribing, and some of those things, really looking at what we can do to support people with a safer supply of their drug that they're using, or something similar to the drug that they might be using, is really looking at that principle, I believe.
Perfect.
Thanks.
Well, yes, and those harm reduction principles are available, and the fine folks of virtual care will ensure that those get sent out at the end of this, and any other links that we share throughout this presentation. And so I'm curious, Elise, now being, you know, the background that you came from, I wonder if there's, I guess I always say case study or cases. Is there an example of some of this work that you've done in practice, and maybe share some of your learnings that came from that experience?
I think, I mean, the biggest part of, you know, supporting someone with around their substance use is just, again, how unique and how, you know, people have lots of strong opinions from outside the person's life. Like you talked about, you and your mom getting into some disagreement about what's treatment, what works, what, you know, I think, you know, one of the slogans in 12 Steps is it works if you work it. And just kind of some of these things that people really believe, because it's worked and it's been effective for them, that it's the only way to go. And so I think of, you know, some of the lessons learned is really just, again, validating, like, what's the person's goals? What are they looking for in different aspects of their life, and being clear and sometimes writing it down just to get it out of their head and just say, okay, this is where they want to be. And this may or may not relate to their substance use. Maybe they can continue on in a different pattern with their substance use, or maybe they want to take a break or whatever. Like, but just taking the substance use sometimes out of it and really building out what this preferred future is and what their goal in their life is. And I think of a young person I worked with that, you know, was like, had some pretty significant substance use, and was, you know, experiencing homelessness, and was somebody who often, you know, will say to this day, I think that insight saved their life, and that just really being able to access supervised consumption. And it wasn't just the supervised consumption, it was the relationships that were built there. And and the trust that was built there in a system that they hadn't felt trust anywhere, really. You know, the school system had isolated, you know, they still had some connections with their family, but every other formal system had just really not shown up in the way we want it to. And so, you know, so those relationships and insight were there. And, you know, I think they went through Onsite, which is a detox up above Insight, and, you know, went through a few different treatment centers and went through a few different groups. And I think sometimes they come out and feel like this, you know, oh, I didn't finish it, or I left early, or I don't know. And really the lesson often was, well, where are you now? Where do you want to be? And like, what have you picked up along the way? And there's always like some gem or something that worked for them. But if we had paid attention to all the things, all the barriers or the reasons why it hadn't worked, or what you know, their triggers, and I think there was such richness in just figuring out what did you get from that? What do you want to bring forward, and kind of continuing on and showing up regardless of how, like, whether their substance use was continuing on or not, just asking them to what they wanted to build out their life. And ultimately, this is somebody who really, you know, found some medication-assisted treatment really helpful. And then it was like really getting back into school and getting into work and getting into things that really filled their cup, like helped them feel like they were doing what it was they wanted to do. And so I think that was always kind of the lesson is there's just the importance of those relationships early on, and finding things that spaces where somebody doesn't feel judged. They just feel like they can show up and be themselves, and that be safe. And I don't know if that really answers.
No, it totally does. No, yeah, no, you did a great. And so I guess I'm hoping that in our kind of conclusion and concluding this lovely webinar today, I'm hoping that we can just briefly mention, you know, just some of the different alternative methods and pathways to recovery. Because I know traditionally, I think a lot of people in the world think, okay, well, I have a problem. I need to find my local Alcoholics Anonymous meeting, This is where it starts, and this is the route. And though that is a very valid route and has been successful and important for many people, it's not the only route. Yeah. And there's many, and so one that I highlight more recently is this Wellbriety method. Wellbriety, I believe is how it's pronounced, which is similar to the 12-step program, but it exists with an Indigenous worldview and emphasizes healing through traditional means, whether that's through sweat lodges, smudging ceremonies, talking circles, sharing experiences, and then instead of in AA you would get the medal, the sobriety for how long since you had last. The chip, thank you. Instead you get an eagle feather that comes to make what the word is not coming to me. You get the 12 eagle feathers, I think, through to make like a headdress that you wear in honor of the work and healing that you've done as part of the Wellbriety method. So that was one that I only just found out about probably about a year ago. An elder who was in Alberta or Mohkinstsis, where I was living, had actually brought that one up to me. So that one is something I think different and one worth checking out to help support folks who are looking to participate in some form of recovery.
Yeah, and I think it's amazing just to think of, and that's I think an important part to consider is like so we think about what someone's recovery journey might be. I think usually the conversation is like, what are their biological or physical needs, like kind of making sure those things are met. And sometimes that's when medication comes on board too, if they're going to withdraw or something like that. And then there's the psychological kind of what do they need to kind of nurture their kind of psychological kind of connections and coping skills and perhaps some other things. And then there's the social and social cultural, and so kind of looking at kind of all these different pieces, and then spiritual, and I feel like I'm forgetting biopsychosocial spiritual. Yeah, sorry. In my mind, which is some of the things I'm often thinking about. And so depending on kind of what the needs are, what the goals are in each of those areas is sometimes what we'll think about for what kind of what options to offer. And I think it's one of those things that really I don't know, it just really bugs me that how challenging it is to navigate services in BC and everywhere. It's not specific to BC because I think, part of it is that it's unique and that's important, but also there's just like, the fact that you just found out about Wellbriety like a year ago, like the fact that things aren't as widely understood or as widely accessible, I think it's a real shame because there's lots of really great services out there, and lots of, many communities have free or a health authority funded drug and alcohol counseling or addictions counseling. So usually those are individual. They often have youth or adult or elder, like they often have a range. So you can access addictions counseling usually in the health authority. And there's outreach into schools, and there's usually like seniors programs. So there's lots of different kinds of services out there that are often sort of specific to a location. But and then the other thing I just want to talk about too is people often want to know about residential treatment and what that's like. And that's, again, a helpful thing to have a conversation with a counselor or peer support or a navigator to help figure out kind of what residential treatment might be, like what it might look like, what's appropriate. There's lots of different kinds of residential treatments out there. And there's Indigenous focused residential treatment programs, and there's AA or 12-step based, and there's other ones as well. So it's just like important to kind of know what the options are and make an informed decision with someone to navigate that with, whether it's like I said, a navigator, a family friend, a counselor, something like that.
Totally.
And then, we want to talk about some of the groups. So one of my groups that I always like to talk about, in addition to Wellbriety, there's the 16 steps, which is like, again, more empowerment. It's a bit more empowerment focused. And I think it was originally developed for women. And so, but it's across the spectrum. But it's just a different kind of model. And the other one I really appreciated when I lived in Vancouver, and they are available online as refuge recovery, and it takes like a Buddhist mindfulness perspective, and it always had like this kind of like punk rocky kind of like alternative feel to it. So I think maybe I always felt like I just felt drawn to it a bit, but it took a kind of a different approach to recovery, but with a similar result of like looking at how do we cope with this. How do we cope with the stress, with the triggers, how do we come together in a mindful way to get through some of these experiences that that we're all going through.
I was gonna say, one model that I think is very popular too, and one that I know we offer through Foundry Virtual is the Smart Recovery, the self-management in recovery training. So that 10 out of 10. That program as well, like there's someone and it is called, I put OYNB. It's 1 year no beer. It's a challenge for those who maybe are worried about their alcohol consumption. And it's more of a youthful kind of feel, and it's a challenge in a community. 1 year no beer. There's also Recovery 2.0, which is much more holistic work done by, I believe it's Tommy Rosen, who suffered from addictions in his own journey and then has developed this holistic approach to this work. So there's a wealth of resources, and I hope that, you know, this space that's been created here and this opportunity allowed you to see some of those things and see some of the basis and the foundations of effective work as service providers, as human beings on this place called Earth.
What was, like, are there any kind of key messages or things you want to make sure people hear? I don't know how this whole webinar thing works, so like, I don't know, is there, like, do we wrap up now? I don't know if I think we have questions, but is there anything like you want to make sure people hear before we kind of move into questions or other things to talk about?
No, I think it's connection. And I hope that's been interweaved through some of the things. You know, there's so much complexity to all of this work that we do, and I think it's recognizing at the heart of it all should be in connection and connecting to one another and connecting people together.
Awesome,
thank you. And so I don't know, our lovely facilitators of today's webinar, I don't believe we had, if there was any questions throughout today's session, we'll ask them now, but we did get our questions in advance and we interweaved the answers throughout this webinar for the folks watching today. So Paige, I guess we'll check with you if there's any more.
Yeah, we'll just give people a minute for the live Q&A that is open, just to give people time to type at the end of the webinar. But while we wait a minute for that, I was wondering if either of you can expand on the alternative groups, if you know, with the impact of COVID, have they all moved online, just in terms of accessibility during this challenging time? Yeah, just wondering if either of you could touch base on that while we wait for some questions.
I think your dog wants to weigh in on that one, RJ. I think your puppy's got some ideas. I think, yeah, I think with COVID, there's been some highly public kind of concerns with people not being able to access in-person self-help and mutual aid groups, and that puts people at really significant risk. And I just think of that importance of not being able to sort of share space and go for coffee and hugs and those things that really are important for many people's recovery. So a lot of groups are available online now, and in some ways, that's why I think it's important for folks to put in their search engine, to some of these different ideas Wellbriety and all these other groups, just to see what's available and if you can access some things online. Like I said, Refuge Recovery was the one I often would recommend or connect people with if they were kind of in a mindfulness space. And they weren't available in many places, but there's some in Vancouver, but now they're available online. And so that might be another option. So I think there's a lot more of online options than there were before this COVID pandemic. But there's some that are in person. You just have to check and call the local group and see what's available.
Yeah, I would just say to highlight that after Lena has calmed down. Yeah, just connecting into your own community. The folks that we connect with are obviously across BC, and the urban connections to technology versus rural are going to look different. I did hear that there were some groups meeting in public, just in open space in parks through AA. So yeah, check out some of these names and see how those programs are operating in your local communities.
Yeah, and the other thing I realized we didn't talk, I kind of glossed over in some ways because it's only been a couple of years that Foundries have been up and running through the province, and so and I think I was practicing much more before those. And so, you know, when I'd say refer for local health authorities to see what drug and alcohol counselor might be available, also your local Foundries, the Foundry centers, and as well as Foundry Virtual have, you know, both walk-in counseling that's just like goal focused and what somebody wants to come in, and also some pathways into substance use counseling and groups and some of those other key pieces. So
awesome. So it doesn't look like we have any questions, but thank you both so much for that fantastic conversation and sharing your experiences. Thanks everyone for attending the webinar series, and if you missed any of the other webinars, you'll be able to access them online shortly on our Foundry website. And thanks everyone, and have a great night.
Thanks everyone.